Welcome back to the Johnny Gets Cash channel and to the third instalment in the Daihatsu Fourtrak restoration series. Last time you saw me remove the interior of the Fourtrak and begin to get the body ready to be removed from the chassis, so today I'll be doing just that, liberating the chassis and stripping it ready for sandblasting and repairs before the rebuild. Before I get started, I wanted to show you the underside of the truck as it currently is and go through some of the areas I already know will need addressing. Firstly, I have to comment on the inner sills. They're surprisingly good considering the state of the outer sills, but no doubt I'll end up giving them some attention regardless. Back to the focus of this episode and the chassis itself. Again, this isn't too horrendous generally speaking, but there's one major issue that has to be addressed. This Fourtrak has previously had the original crossmember replaced, most likely due to corrosion, as this is a common failure point for these trucks, but in the case of this crossmember, it's been replaced with a piece of box section. The problem with that is the crossmember should have a passover in it to accommodate the vertical movement of the prop shaft when under load. It's a miracle the prop hasn't been damaged by this flat box section already. Now, this will be getting changed in this episode along with any other issues that I find along the way. So without further ado, let's get the body off and take a better look at the chassis of this 23-year-old beast. The first thing I want to do is remove that fuel tank, which means removing decades of dirt. Next, I need to try and persuade these bolts to come out, but it's fair to say I'm expecting to have to drill out quite a few snap studs. With that done and the tank out of the way, I can move on to giving the chassis a quick once over with the wire wheel. I am having this chassis sandblasted, but doing this allows me to get a better understanding of the overall condition and any particular problem spots beforehand. Next up, I want to give the engine and gearbox a quick clean up before removal. With the engine removed and the chassis now back in the workshop, I can start work on removing the axles and any suspension components ahead of sandblasting. Now is a good time to go over a few choice areas with the needle scaler. Having removed the rear axle and suspension components, we are left with a bare chassis and axles ready for blasting, and this pile of parts, all of which will be repaired, restored or replaced as needed before being bolted back onto the chassis. After blasting, this is what we're left with, some fresh looking parts as well as some pretty ugly previous repairs. These will all be remedied shortly, but right now the priority is to get this bare metal protected to prevent flash rusting. To do this, I'm covering everything in an anti-corrosion bare metal primer. I'll also inject this into the chassis for good measure. Now it's time to do something productive and start with the repairs. First, I'll tackle those corroded upper spring platforms. Note that the chassis is upside down here. This also gives me an opportunity to clean up and protect the usually hidden parts of the chassis. As replacement parts aren't available here, I'll fabricate new spring platforms from scratch. Now that the spring platforms are done, I can close up the holes that I cut in the chassis legs to get any loose rust flakes etc. out during the prep stage. With the chassis flipped over, I'm going around and grinding back any areas that need repairs. As you've already seen the process, I won't show you all of the repairs in detail. Now it's time to deal with the main issue this chassis has, that crossmember. I had this extremely tough crossmember made by a local agricultural engineer and fabricator, so it's safe to say that it's built tough. With the box section crossmember now removed, we can see the state of the chassis rails behind, and no doubt the reason for the box section, rather than the proper passover style tube. This is what we're left with after a quick clean up with the grinder. The internal faces of the chassis rails are beyond saving, so they'll be cut out ahead of the new crossmember going in, and then plated up to the tube afterwards. Now it's a case of double checking the location of the crossmember, as the prop shaft of the Fourtrak is off centre, so it's important that the new crossmember aligns with this. With the chassis flipped over again, I can start to fabricate the support gussets on the underside. Daihatsu left the ends of their gussets open, and this is a well-known mud trap, so on mine I'm closing them in. I'll drill a small drainage hole afterwards that will also allow me to inject wax oil inside to help protect it. From the factory, Daihatsu also left the ends of the crossmember open to the elements, which might be why they're so prone to corrosion. As I want to future-proof this truck as much as possible, I'm planning to cap the ends. Now, in order to make sure I protect the crossmember as much as possible though, once capped I'll drill a small hole and inject wax oil into the crossmember before plugging that hole with weld. The reason I'm doing it this way and not wax oiling before capping is because plugging a small drilled hole in the centre of the cap will generate a lot less heat and burn less of the wax oil away, meaning more of it will remain to protect the crossmember in the future. For the purposes of injection, I thin wax oil by around 10% with white spirit. And that signals the end of the repairs to the chassis, which means it's now time to give it its final protective coat. I'm using UPOL Gravitex for this, as I find it gives a decent level of coverage as well as a tough, good looking finish. This will dry to a matte finish, but for now, hopefully these shots will give you an idea of how the chassis will look. Once this dries, it's time to flip the chassis over one last time so that I can coat the other side and do the final lot of wax injection throughout. Thank you very much for watching, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next instalment in the series. Until next time, cheers.